Uh, Welcome, everyone. I'm excited that so many people are here from all over the world. And the reason I really appreciate your participation is so that we can have your live questions and therefore be able to answer them. It's impossible for me to anticipate all the different types of questions that could come up. I'm not really sure what range we have in terms of how much familiarity there is with the principles of Waldorf education or the research that supports the role of the arts in education and how that's linked with neurological development and so forth. So much of what I'm going to try and present here today. So having your questions really helps us fill in any gaps that there may be. And so please be reassured that any and all questions are welcome. Please don't sit on a question because of anything that might make you hesitate to ask it. Please just ask it and we'll do our best. I will do my best to answer it. Yeah, so with that, let me just say that my name is Rev Bowen. I've been a Waldorf educator for over 23 years now. I no longer work in a school. I worked in a Waldorf school for 22 years. I was a class teacher for 18 years. Then I was a pedagogical director for 2 and the school administrator for 1 year. Through all of that experience, what I came to really value were the principles at work in Waldorf education. I'm not here to tell you that Waldorf education is the end all be all like any other educational system. It has its inherent benefits and gifts and strengths, as well as its challenges. I do think that there are principles at work in Waldorf education that are universally applicable in any system and are just helpful and healthy for the development of human beings in this day and age, even in these modern times. And so much of the principles that were presented by the founder, Rudolf Steiner, are continually being supported by new research, even on the neurological level. So I just always find that to be fascinating. I want it to be known clearly, I am not a Rudolf Steiner worshiper. I do not subscribe to any sense of cultism. I think he was a remarkable human being, had so much to offer in that way. But it's just, he was a human being. So I don't believe that any and everything that was ever uttered or written by Rudolf Steiner is the absolute truth. I believe, as he did suggest for us, I believe we must constantly be reevaluating and researching what works best in education, what works best for human development. So with that being said, I hope that this little presentation works in that regard and is just one more step of us considering questions, exploring possibilities, looking at new research, and hopefully either finding new information that helps us, or we're just being reassured with what we already know. Because I think some of what I'm going to present today is what those of you who have come to such a webinar already think and believe. And maybe this will just be one of those experiences where we get to reassure ourselves that yes, indeed, this is good. What we're doing is good. So with that, I am going to begin and share my screen. Here we go. So let me move this. I have a little box that's in my way. There we go. Okay, so brain-body development. It's so tempting in this modern age, especially with the more and more detailed and advanced ways that we can research the human being, it is so tempting to take on a mechanistic view. And by that, I mean that we look at the human being as a sum total of parts. It's almost, as if we could take the whole human being apart and put the human being back together. Again, very mechanistic. So I just want to reiterate this really important principle that even with the brain, we're not talking about this separate organ that is an entity in and of itself, one that will develop in and of itself, one that is almighty or the preeminent organ, or however it might be tempting to see it, but to remember that the whole human being is an entirety. The brain is certainly an important part of that entirety. While a human being can lose a finger or even a limb, we certainly can't cut out the brain. So I'm not trying to downplay the brain's importance. It's certainly very important, but it is still part of the whole human being. And so the optimal development, when we think of the body, the rest of the human being, in a physical sense, the optimal development of that body will affect the optimal development of the brain, and vice versa. The optimal development of the brain will have its effects on the optimal development of the body. Seems simple, but I just want to make sure we're keeping this in mind. And whenever I use the term neurological, it just makes me remember to proceed cautiously, that we don't too drastically differentiate between what's happening in the brain and what's happening in the rest of the human being. So let's look at some forces. This is the way that Rudolf Steiner wanted educators and even doctors and really everyone to understand the human being, that we have three primary forces at work in our development. The first of which are the will forces. And you can think of these, I'll just read it and then talk a little bit more about it. The will forces are expressed most obviously through the limbs, the will to do. The will forces come through the young child strongly as they learn to be in their bodies and to do new things. Very early in development, this force is embodied in play. The will forces themselves are natural and universal. So again, this is just that impulse that comes through even the newborn child to do things. I mean, in some respects, you could say there's an element of instinct involved there, absolutely. And yet it goes beyond that, because we know, for example, from research that was done years and years ago, that if a child, if a toddler does not see other human beings around it standing upright and walking, it is less likely to strive in that direction. But when the young child in its environment perceives certain things, it has this will to do, to imitate, to learn, to play, to explore, to try new things with its body, and to learn about its environment. And this is, again, there's a great overlap there with what we would call instinct. And yet we know too, just from our own language, that there's more to it than that when we consider a will force. We do it, well, not all of us, but some of us at least attempt at New Year's to experience and exert our will forces when we speak that New Year's resolution that I am no longer going to eat chocolate cake or whatever it might be. I'm going to exercise regularly. I am going to, whatever it may be. We know that within that, we're now going beyond instinct. We are having to call upon a different force within ourselves, something that will resist, in this case, certain urges, such as that craving for sugar, or something that will call upon us to exert our own power to do something, such as exercising more regularly, and so forth. So Rudolf Steiner, and again, this is a very simplistic way of looking at the human being, but nevertheless, Rudolf Steiner wanted a simple picture to start with so that we could begin to have a simple key or a simple lens in which we can understand human development and how the human being will learn and grow and live. And the will forces are a foundational part of that. So we see them very clearly in early childhood. It's not superimposed, for example, with the other two forces, the feeling forces and the thinking forces. This is not to say that there are no feeling forces. Obviously, there are some feeling forces even in the very, very young child. We see it. The child gets upset and cries, or the child feels pleasant and is calm, or the child sees something funny and it laughs. There are feeling forces there, certainly, and even some thinking forces in the most rudimentary stage of development. But in the first 7 years, or really what we would say from birth to dentition, we have the will forces most prominently, most strongly, and most purely emerging as the forces by which we grow and learn. And so that's what is encapsulated here. The discovery phase of will forces, the time in which they come through the human being more strongly than any others, and in the purest form, is from birth to dentition, around the age of 7. During this phase, movement and play are vitally important for healthy development. So the child needs to crawl. The child needs to play with things, needs to chew on things. We know that it's important for children to nurse. Just even the physical activity of suction actually helps in their development. We know now that children who are allowed to crawl freely actually activate that part of their brains that will later play an important role in their linguistic functions. There are all sorts of connections being found today that can be rooted in these early stages of the development of a human being, where they move and play. This is why we find in the Waldorf school no emphasis on academic learning before first grade. In other schools, we have seen the academics being pushed into lower and lower levels of the systems, but not in a Waldorf school. We still value movement and play. So in any type of education, even using Waldorf principles in homeschooling, this is a very important aspect to understand and keep in mind. In the next stage of development, we come to the feeling forces. The feeling forces come through us as emotions, which we often display and express, but not always. These forces also exist as a sense for our surroundings and the emotions of others. Our emotional health relates very strongly to our sense of social fulfillment and well-being. Thus, the feeling forces are both within us as individuals and between us as we relate to one another. So this, again, this principle can be seen in our language. Of course, we all know what our feelings are, and I've chosen some graphics here to illustrate a range of feelings or emotions that we can experience. And at the same time, we also know what it means when someone says, I feel you. If they're trying to express that they understand. Yes, I feel that. There is more to it than just emotions. There's more to it than just even having emotional literacy, which we do hope to develop with children in these years between dentition and puberty. We hope to support their emotional growth and development. There's also this role that the feeling forces play in our social interactions. The emotional literacy transcends into social health, social well-being, social flexibility, empathy, sympathy, understanding. So the feeling forces are more than just the experience of emotions. The discovery phase of feeling forces, the time in which they come through the human being more strongly than any others, and in the purest form, is from dentition around the age of 7 to puberty around the age of 14. During this phase, daily and weekly rhythms, wide-ranging experiences, and the establishment of beneficial habits are vitally important. Now, that's a lot I just said right there in that bottom section. During this phase, daily and weekly rhythms, wide-ranging experiences, and the establishment of beneficial habits are vitally important. There's so much of what Waldorf education incorporates in those first grades from 1st through 8th that are attempting to embody those principles right there. We establish daily and weekly rhythms in Waldorf education. We bring a wide range of experiences to the child in Waldorf education during those years. And we attempt to do all this while also establishing beneficial habits during these years, because we know, and research supports, that habits will form during these years, and those habits can either be beneficial or they can be detrimental. So if, for example, children during these years are supported in developing a habit of cleaning up after themselves, whether it's their school work or their play in their own bedroom or in the living room or doing the dishes, helping with the dishes, and so forth. If they are helped to establish those activities and behaviors as habits during these years between the ages of around 7 to approximately 14, then those same habits are much more likely to persist throughout life, and will support them when they're out on their own as adults. If, on the other hand, they've not developed those habits, then they will have developed the flip side of those habits. It's not simply a lack of developing a good habit. Without a good habit, then the other habit is formed, which means they've developed the habit of not cleaning up after themselves, of not helping with chores, of not being orderly and neat. We could use 100 examples of things that we may ourselves struggle with, and understand that the prime time to develop helpful habits that will support a human being, like the current of a river. You can either paddle against the current or have the current helping you. That current is established during these pivotal years when the feeling forces are so much at play. And again, it's not just emotions, it's having an overall sense for life around us. And if we have just held a home life, for example, where cleaning up after oneself and helping with chores, when that's just part of the normal environment, then as adults, the child who experienced that in their home, that child is more likely to just continue that behavior without even thinking about it, because it doesn't need to rise up into their thinking forces. It's something they experienced. It's part of the rhythms they knew. They just felt it in that broadest sense, and it feels good, and they will continue it because it's what they knew during those formative years. So this can apply to so many things. This feeling force, these establishments of rhythms and habits with the wide range of experiences, these are vital, as I say, vitally important in the development of the child during that phase. Lastly, we come to the thinking forces, which begin to emerge after puberty. The thinking forces themselves are not readily expressed through the body, meaning they're more inside of us, if you will. We can use our language systems, even numeric ones, to express thoughts, logic, ideas, etc. But these are symbolic means of expression. Even sign language, which you could think of as a physical, way of expressing thought and ideas, even sign language is symbolic like this. The thinking forces are quite individuated in this way. So understanding what I mean by individuated, all we have to do is ask ourselves how well someone can truly understand our own thoughts. I can understand the behavior, just the physical movement of someone else when they're walking. I get it. They're walking. They're going somewhere. It's a bit harder to understand someone's feeling forces, even if we're only talking about their emotions. We tend to be pretty good about it when someone's upset, when they're sad, when they're happy. We tend to understand this fairly well, but not always. All we have to do is have a conversation when we have some of those, a mixture of emotions stirred up in ourselves, and we find that it's not always quite so obvious and easy. And then it gets even harder when we come to the thinking forces, and it's more difficult to understand the thinking forces of another person, their own thoughts and ideas, because it's so individual, and it is such an inner process, an inner journey. The things we think, the ideas we have, the questions we live with, all of these things are very individual. And so it makes sense that these thinking forces arise and come to their prominence as a modality of learning after puberty. We see it in the individual's behaviors. We see our own children begin to individuate at this time. They're rejecting some of the ideas that we as their parents and teachers have shared with them all their lives. They're trying to figure out what they themselves think, what their opinions are, what their beliefs are, and so forth. So we see that the discovery phase of thinking forces, the time in which they come through the human being more strongly than any others, and in the purest form, is from puberty around the age of 14 to the beginning of adulthood around the age of 21. During this phase, experience of expertise, logic, boundaries, and models of healthy maturity are vitally important. So I want to take a break from the visual presentation and just talk a little bit about those last statements, especially that experience of the model of healthy maturity. This is really key. I know that some of you may be parents of younger children right now. Perhaps you don't have experience working with teenagers yet, but you're heading there. So I think this will be of interest to anyone. My own children are both in their 20s. And as I said in the beginning, I've taught for a couple of decades now. And I can say that the most critical factor that I have used in my own growth as a teacher and as a parent, as well as what I've advised as a mentor to other new teachers, has been how important it is to understand this principle that upon the reaching of puberty, the youth will behave in ways that are quite, at times, not always, but sometimes they're quite confrontive, even combative. They simply must, in order to individuate, they must reject the ideas of others. So the rebel without a cause, the misbehaving youth, all these sort of stereotypes of the teenager are real for this innate and necessary step of development that they must go through. They have to reject what they've been reared upon, the belief systems of their parents and the principles of their society and so forth. At least to some extent, they have to rebel in order to find themselves. And we must always remember that it is not personal. It's going to sound very personal at times when they say things such as to their parents, I don't believe you. You're a liar. I hate you. I don't love you. I don't think you love me. I think you hate me. Why are you trying to make my life miserable? All of these are impersonal expressions. Now, I say that based on a theoretical average I'm applying to all of you. I'm going to apply a theoretical average that all of you have more or less a healthy relationship with your children, okay? So there could be real times where that's not the case. And in that situation, perhaps the youth, the adolescent, is saying things that apply differently. I hate you, and maybe they really do want to get away from an abusive situation. Okay, I get that those are realistic possibilities. But holding that aside and looking at the healthy average, whatever that is, but the healthy relationship that parents have with their children, they're going along, nobody's perfect, but we're doing pretty well here. Even in that situation, the adolescent will need to rebel, and this is part of their development, their maturation, and they will say things along the way because their thinking forces, which we just talked about, their thinking forces, which are just dawning, they do not have great control of them. And they have even less control because of all the hormonal fluctuations that accompany adolescence. They have even less control of their emotions. You put those two in the blender of the teenage years, and you have a perfect recipe for some crazy behavior, such as we see in adolescence. And so they will say and do things that seem very hurtful, very personally directed at us as their adults, their parents and teachers. And we have to, I say this with absolute stress and emphasis, we have to learn how to not take these things personally. If we enter their little drama by taking it personally, we are playing into it as if we ourselves are teenagers as well. We do nothing but muddle the situation and create a greater sense that what they are saying and thinking and feeling is actually legitimate reality. I am not saying we need to tell them that they are full of it or misguided or that their thinking is young and immature. I wouldn't say any such things, but I would try to remain the mature adult. I will try to not fall into the emotional drama that they stir up. I will attempt to show them, even in these moments where they may be striking out against me, again, as teacher or parent, that I will remain calm, that I will remain reasonable, that I still will retain my compassion for them, my care for them, for their well-being, and I will also hold healthy boundaries so that they continually, even in these years of tumultuous behavior and experiences, even then, they will have a primary experience of healthy adulthood. Because as much as they're saying they reject us, I'm here to tell you, they come through that dark passage and it changes. Once they reach the age, and it differs for every child, but somewhere between 18 and 21, you will find them return with a newfound sense of respect and a new way of relating to you. And it will be either buoyed or hampered by what you chose to do. And I made plenty of mistakes. So trust me, I'm also speaking from experience of mistakes. By what we choose to do during that time when they tried to make it personal. If we take it personal, we continue to muddle the situation. If we can rise above that, we actually not only help ourselves resist the drama, we more importantly help the child learn and see by reflection, eventually, not immediately, but eventually, what it means to rise up and be an adult. Okay. So I've presented so far just a little bit about the threefold human nature, thinking forces, willing forces, willing forces, feeling forces, and thinking forces in that order. I just want to see if, Brian, if we have any key questions I need to answer before I go on.
We have two questions. One is, what if a child under the age of 7 expresses a strong interest in mathematics and always says, I want to learn math, teach me math, give me math problems, etc.?
Yeah, great question, and certainly something that educators have to encounter constantly. For one reason, our children are far more exposed to the greater world through, whether it's through media or whatever. And so the influences of higher education, besides commercialism and whatever else is out there, those come to our children earlier and earlier in life than, say, 50 years ago. So there's part of the question that I have to give to every parent who asks these kinds of questions. It's for you also to consider what is motivating these questions. Does the child have an older sibling or neighbors or cousins, or is the child watching videos where it's been stressed that in order to be smart, you need to do math? You know, there's so many variables that can be influencing this child's interest. So that's part of the consideration. I don't need to know the specifics of this child here because I don't want to go down too many specific paths like that. But I will say that's part of the consideration. But even holding that to the side, let's say, and there are sometimes legitimately self-interested, mathematically inclined children who have a precocious but natural interest in learning numbers, the number system, how to work with math. I've seen it directly. If I don't think there's too much outside influence that's artificially creating such an interest, then I will go for exploring it slowly but surely with that child. I don't think, and research supports this, there is no need to think, uh-oh, the iron is hot, we have to strike now, or we might waste this mathematical genius. There's nothing actually that supports that belief. That being said, there's also nothing that says it's going to be harmful to go ahead and start with that child and do a little bit of math with that child, because if that's where their natural interest is, I certainly don't want to thwart what could be that child's genius as well. There's a great book out right now. Maybe it came out 2 years ago. It was a #1 New York Times bestseller called Range, R-A-N-G-E. The author's last name is Epstein, but I forget the first name, and I certainly don't want to say the wrong one here. It's a great book, and it really brings a lot of research to bear that supports this idea that we do not need to go for depth early in life. In other words, we don't need to pick a single pursuit and dive deeply into it early in life. Really, range is important for the child. That's why, we wrote there in the feeling forces, wide-ranging experiences are key to the development both of the child's well-roundedness in a general sense, but also in terms of their neurological development. We're going to get to that in a little bit. So range, if you haven't read this book or looked into it, I highly recommend it. And it talks about, it talks about this question of depth versus breadth. And so here too, I would say you could certainly explore math, but don't have that feeling that we need to go deeply, quickly with math. You know, you can whet the appetite a little bit without having to go, into algebra by first grade with such a student. Just take your time with it. There's plenty of time. You can certainly play mathematical games and have mathematical puzzles and do all sorts of mathematical things. That doesn't mean you're going deeply into math. That's my advice there. And there was one more question.
Yeah, the other, are these 3 stages of development similar to the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, and classical education?
I don't know. Perhaps. I'm not even going to attempt to answer that question. That's certainly not my specialty. It might be. Don't know. Somebody asked, what's the name of the book? It's right there. David, yep. There we go. David Epstein. Thank you so much, Lucy, for providing that. And the book's called Range. That's the title of the book. Great one. Great one. And there are lots of books like this. He just did an especially good job more recently of encapsulating this idea. But there's lots of research on this front to support the wide range of experiences that children need to have. Okay, we're going to move on to the next part. Oops. Okay. So you may have heard, if you've ever looked at Waldorf schools, a lot of them have these little slogans, educating the head, heart, and hands. And I just wanted to point out that is why we hear the head, heart, and hands. They're just symbols of these 3 forces that are so important in human development. The head, of course, is the thinking symbol. The heart is the symbol of the feeling forces, and the hands are the symbol of the willing forces, the forces to do things. Well, that's just to pull that curtain back a little bit. So again, this is sort of a reiteration of where we started. Each of these phases of growth are affected by neurological developments, and each one also affects neurological development. So once again, I just want to repeat it. The brain does not exist in a vacuum. It is part of the whole human being. And likewise, what we do with the rest of our body has a direct influence upon the brain's development. So how does this work? What are the mechanisms we can understand for this interrelated and mutual influence between the willing, feeling, and thinking forces and neurological development? So here's a little example. Gosh, I could have done and presented so much research on this front, but I'm not trying to write a dissertation here. I just want to present one example. This is related to the will forces and the social emotional development in children. In 2014, Sergio Pellis, a researcher at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada, said in an interview with NPR, National Public Radio, that play helps develop neurons. For instance, play helps develop neurons in the prefrontal cortex, which will later be used in the brain's executive control center, regulating emotions, making plans, and solving problems. Play, he said, prepares a person for love, life, and schoolwork. He added that free play, with no rules, no umpires, no courts, no required equipment, and so forth, free play is especially important for the younger child. The freedom and resulting decisions help develop the child neurologically. Quote, whether it's rough and tumble or two kids deciding to build a sandcastle together, the kids have to negotiate. Well, what are we going to do in this game? And that in and of itself is a very important aspect of play that directly affects neurological development. Again, is there a mechanism at work that applies to all of these stages of human development? Yes. Now I'm getting straight into neurology. It is the role of myelination and synaptic development. I'll repeat those: myelination and synaptic development. So let's understand, now that we're getting into the brain, let's understand neurons and synapses and so forth. There are many types of neural cells, but they all share these similarities. The cell body is called the soma. The main length is called the axon, and the axon splits into many smaller strands called dendrites. This is named after the Greek word dendron, which means tree. And you can see right here in this illustration, you can see the tree-like formation of a neuron. The dendrites of one neuron pass signals to the dendrites of other neurons across a gap called a synapse. And over here on the right, you see a couple of neurons relating to each other, and then there's a close-up of a synaptic gap. And those little pink dots are neurotransmitters, which pass very quickly between the synapse, or across the synapse between the dendrites. And we have a lot of synapses in our brains. There are lots of neural networks, and we're going to talk about some of the staggering numbers during the different phases of our developments. But this is just a basic understanding of kind of the hardwiring system that's going on. And I shouldn't say there's not much emphasis on hard wiring. It's wiring, but it's very malleable, very plastic. We have all sorts of options for growth and redevelopment and re-networking throughout our lives, but it's especially prominent for the developing child. Okay, so myelination. Oh, let me look back at, just to point out, yeah, down here along the axon, you see that myelin sheath, those little golden sort of bubbles along the axon. That's the sheath, the membranous sheath of myelin. Myelination is the process of developing a membranous sheath around the axon of a neural cell. This insulating sheath protects the axon and speeds up the transmission of signals. This sounds like a purely neurological process. I'm just sort of saying that with a reminder that none of these things happen in a vacuum. It's not just that the brain will simply myelinate just because that's what it does. That's not how it works. But when it does, when there is myelination, those neural pathways and those neural networks are protected. And the more that they are stimulated, the more myelin builds up to protect those pathways, and the faster those transmissions happen. This is why we gain skills so well in early childhood, such as learning to play an instrument. It happens rapidly, and the skills can progress quite quickly and the skills become faster. We could play the same song faster and faster with practice. That's easier to do in childhood. It's not impossible to do for us, even as adults, but it's much easier for the child to learn these new skills and to learn them and speed them up quite quickly. So the anecdotal story of young Albert Einstein. I want to tell you a little story. I'm a Waldorf teacher, so I just can't resist the opportunity to tell a quick story. We've all maybe heard some stories about Einstein. He supposedly couldn't find his way home. He had to dress in the same clothes because picking out clothes was complicated for him. That supposedly they painted the door of his house a different color than all the other doors on their row so that he could determine which house was his home when he got close enough to it. Another story that's I think less well known but equally well documented is that he really struggled with language and reading early on, and they noticed that even his speech at the age of 5 was not where it needed to be. He wasn't processing language either auditorily or verbally as it seemed a healthy child should, and his parents were consulting doctors at that point because they were so concerned about the development of little Albert. And about this time, he became bedridden with an illness. And while he was bedridden, his parents were quite fretful. So his father gave him a compass, a regular magnetic compass, which Albert found quite fascinating. And his mother gave him a violin and signed him up for music lessons. Now, I will grant you that these are anecdotal. I have no proof that this is what helped Einstein, but we know that something helped his neurological development dramatically, and it happened very quickly after this illness. Once he was able to start participating in the music lessons, and when he started school, he suddenly accelerated in certain subjects, not all subjects, but in certain subjects, he accelerated dramatically. And as we all know, he went on to be one of the greatest thinkers in the scientific world ever. So there might be, I'm just going to put it out there that way, there might be something to the compass and the violin. We may never know for sure, but a lot of people do believe so, including his parents. So it sounds like Einstein experienced a stage or multiple stages of strong neurological growth and development. We know that as the brain grows, more dendrites and synapses, the more neurological or neural networking is achieved for optimal brain function. We know that. That's how that happens. The expanding the number of synapses sounds like a purely neurological process. Once again, nothing happens in a vacuum in the brain. It's affected by what we do with our bodies. But we do not have any objective scientific evidence to prove why it occurred in Albert Einstein. So even without neurological data related to Einstein's development, what do we know today scientifically about the growth of dendrites, expanding the number of synapses, and the promotion of myelination? Obviously, the science of neurological development is incredibly complex. Nevertheless, the basic mechanism factors are quite simple. As we so often find, these come down to both nature and nurture. Nature. The human being is biologically set up to have several key stages of neurological growth. So that's just natural. It's established for every human being. Nurture. Healthy nutrition and adequate physical exercise are always important. Moreover, stimulation is the key to supporting nature's program. In other words, we get all these neural developments, all these synapses and all these dendrites. How do we keep developing them? We must stimulate them. Whenever we engage in any activity, we stimulate various neural networks. The more often these are stimulated, in other words, the more often signals are passed through those networks, the more the dendrites grow, the more the synapses link up, and the more the myelin is created to speed up and protect these networks. So nature's law there at the bottom, Nurture it. Nurture what I've given you. Nurture what nature has given you. Or you could think of it as use it or lose it. So let's look at some average numbers of synapses in the human brain. These are the staggering numbers. At birth, we have around 50 trillion synapses. As toddlers, we have approximately 1 quadrillion synapses. That's a dramatic increase in about 3 years. 1,000 trillion synapses. As a child, before puberty, it reduces to around 600 trillion. Then there's another spike in early adolescence to about 800 trillion. Then again, in late adolescence, it drops to 600 trillion. And as an adult, we find a comfortable average of around 500 trillion synapses. Now, we have to ask ourselves, what is causing these drops and spikes and drops? Why are there drops? What's the use it or lose it principle going on here? Well, the spikes come because nature gives them to us. If we can make the most of them, then they're great for us. 2 most critical periods of neurological development. The 2nd or 3rd year of life, we see that big spike up to the 1 quadrillion synapses. And then again, we saw in early adolescence, we climbed up to about 800 trillion. During each of these phases, the synaptic connections are doubled. In other words, the body is just throwing out all sorts of potential for us to use and preserve. And then, after nature has provided all this, it asks us if we have nurtured it. Did you use it? Because we need to myelinate those pathways. So these critical periods are followed by what's known as synaptic pruning. So between the 2 to 10 years of age, there where we saw the first decline, and then again in late adolescence where we saw the other decline. Synaptic pruning, it happens. If we don't use it, we lose it. And so this leads us to the obvious question. Besides good nutrition and bodily exercise, what are the other best ways to nurture this neurological abundance? What are the best ways to stimulate, develop, and protect this neurological potential? Of course, you know what I'm going to say because it's the title of this webinar. It's the arts. It's all this wide range of activities that we do that has the most dramatic effect on neurological development. And here's a little bit of supporting evidence, just a little. Music, for example. In several studies, children who took piano lessons for 6 months improved their ability to work puzzles and solve their other spatial tasks by as much as 30%. Why does playing an instrument make such a difference? Researchers believe that musical training creates new pathways in the brain. Music instruction appears to accelerate brain development in young children, particularly in the areas of the brain responsible for processing sound, language development, speech perception, and reading skills. May 2016, a study led by Yale University researchers observed a phenomenon they termed the drawing effect, that illustrating a word's meaning always leads to the highest levels of memory recall. So if you're ever struggling to commit a big presentation of memory, sketching it out may help you better retain the information. Dr. Michael Posner, professor emeritus at the University of Oregon and an adjunct professor at the Weill Medical College of Cornell University, explained in a 2009 article for the Dana Foundation that because art improves cognitive functioning, researchers have hypothesized that performing any kind of art can improve your attention and focus. We know that the brain has a system of neural pathways dedicated to attention. We know that training these attention networks improves general measures of intelligence, wrote Dr. Posner. We can be fairly sure that focusing our attention on learning and performing an art, if we practice frequently and are truly engaged, activates those same attention networks. Even knitting. Research suggests that the constant soothing motion of needle art can enhance the release of serotonin, a neurotransmitter in the body, which plays a key role in mood regulation, learning, sleep, and pain perception. So that's not exhaustive research, obviously. There's there's so much research out there. I encourage you to look for it for yourself. But I did want to bring some examples of how research is affirming what we know, that it engages so much of a human being. Let's just think about something like acting, even a little skit for young children in a play where they try to embody a character such as a lion, and they're trying to behave like a lion, and maybe they have some lines to read and speak as a lion, and whatever it may be, they're bringing something through their whole selves. Perhaps they need to sing a song as a lion in the play, whatever. All of this is engaging the human being on multiple levels. Their will forces are engaged, their feeling forces are engaged, their thinking forces are engaged. And because the human being is engaged on all these levels simultaneously, the brain is being stimulated through many various neural networks at the same time. And in other words, we are lighting it up. We are lighting up these neural pathways. And because we're stimulating them, we are telling that brain, these are important pathways to preserve, myelinate, protect these. Later, when the body goes through the natural process of synaptic pruning, those networks are protected, not to be used solely as acting like a lion. That's not how neurons work. They are available for functioning, for executive functionings, for decision making, for planning, for creative associations, for problem solving, for logic, and so forth. So by protecting these neural pathways through activation and myelination, we set that young human being up to be optimally enhanced on a neurological level, besides being emotionally healthy, besides having a full range of physical capabilities. We're setting them up on every level to be enhanced and to preserve those enhancements so that they can be applied in whatever situations, whether it's social situations with a partner or a friend or a spouse or a boss or co-workers, whether it's the question of what career are we going to choose in life? Where do I find meaningful activity in my choices? What do I sense is healthy for me? All of these things are optimally supported by developing the whole human being, even on that neurological level. And the arts, I'm not saying academics are very important. Academics are definitely very important, but I am saying not that they're unimportant, but that the arts will light up a human being more fully than academics alone. And this is why in a Waldorf education, we find it so absolutely essential to bring the two together, to support the academic work, the skill sets that we're trying to give them, either in language arts or math or science or what have you. If we can incorporate the artistic activities, if we can incorporate artistic activities with those academic pursuits, then we have brought the most rich and well-rounded experience, both for them as just healthy human beings, as well as neurologically developing human beings. This is why neurological development is supported by the arts and vice versa. This is why the arts play such a critical role in all of those ways of understanding a human being. Okay, are there any more questions?
Yeah, we're going to step back a little bit to this question. My daughter is 9 years old. We've asked her and modeled tidying up her bedroom, but I'm still met with resistance. She does help with dishes. Any tips on how to motivate her? I'd like her to create good habits, such tidying up after herself.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's nothing wrong with using a carrot, a reward system, but you just don't want to make them dependent on it. So I say carrots because, you can certainly use punishment. You say this, the carrot and the stick, if you will. It's such a crude expression. But I don't like to use punishment because they create negative associations. And this is all about creating positive associations. The child is much less likely to take up an activity like making her bed if she doesn't have a positive association with that activity. So using a carrot, not literally, okay? I'm not talking about a literal carrot. I am talking about a reward. Using some type of reward system, even the simplest kind, such as anything that they like to do. We could start that a little bit earlier. Maybe, you read with your child at bed and they enjoy that. By the way, there's hardly anything I recommend more strongly than reading at bedtime. Maybe your child enjoys that. So I would say, if you make your bed today, I'll start reading with you 10 minutes earlier. Just the simplest concept of what are the things that they like. You can give them a little bit more of that. And then they begin to build a positive sense of association for that activity. It will become a habit for them within 6 weeks if you can manage to do it daily. It takes about 6 weeks to form a new habit. 6 weeks is not a random number I'm throwing out, by the way. We see it not only through research of creating new habits, and that research is out there, but even the ancients understood this principle, which is why we find that interesting number of 40 days and 40 nights throughout so many different cultures, ancient texts. The period of transformation, whether it was Buddha toward enlightenment or Noah in the ark and so forth, this 40 days and 40 nights is approximately 6 weeks. And the ancients understood that for a true transformation to take place, you need that time frame to maintain something such as meditation or raining for the flood that will change the world. You need that consistent daily experience for about 6 weeks to transform, and you can create new habits in that time frame. So I recommend using a reward system, a very simple one, and then you slowly start removing it after 6 weeks. You don't use it every day. You don't cut them off cold turkey. That's probably not going to work. But just start using it every few days, and then you just say to them, and this is perfectly acceptable to say to a child, you are getting older. You are learning things. Now, if you want me to read a little earlier one night this week, you'll need to make your bed 2 days in a row without me having to remind you, and so forth. You give them these little steps, these little increments they can take in their path toward independence.
Great. I just want to acknowledge that we are at our hour of time together, but we'll continue to answer questions. And also we will be posting the video on our YouTube channel, so you can go back and see that. And if we have any additional questions that go beyond the people dropping off, we can answer those in an email, a follow-up email. So let's get on to the next one. What if you have a child who is reluctant to and really struggles with doing any kind of artwork? Will it eventually come to be a more enjoyable experience? The child is just 5 and in a Waldorf school.
In a Waldorf school, yeah. Boy, there's so many possible reasons for why it might be a difficulty, all the way down to simple, basic questions that have to be answered, such as, does this child have healthy visual processing going on? That's the first place, right down to bodily functions that you need to establish as baselines that these things are in healthy order. But assuming, if I were to assume that, okay, visual processing and healthy motor development, those are all in place and on track for the average child. If those things are in place, then I wouldn't worry about it too much. I would keep an eye on it, certainly. I wouldn't just let it go and assume it's all going to be okay eventually, but I wouldn't worry about it too much at this point. Being exposed to other people, whether it's peers, but also adults, engaging in artistic activities, that's the key, because those forces, especially in kindergarten, we're talking about a child that is pre-dentition, so their teeth haven't come into the changing into the adult teeth. The forces of imitation are especially strong in that first 7-year cycle. And so being exposed to other children, as well as, it's really important that it's adults too. Free play is great, absolutely, and absolutely necessary. But it's also vital that these children see us, their adults around them, engaged in the activities that we want them to take up. So if they don't see adults drawing and painting or singing or whatever, playing instruments, then they need to. That's going to be a critical factor in how willingly they take up such activities.
Great. So what age is a good age to start musical training?
Yeah. Yeah, this one's under debate still, even within the Waldorf movement. A lot of teachers will tell you that because it has so much structure to it, you shouldn't start before the change of teeth. I don't really take such a hard line on that. I would not start, this is me personally, I would not start a child on formal musical lessons before the age of 5. And every child is unique. So, it's very hard to answer this question with a hard line. But that's a hard line for me under the age of 5. I wouldn't even consider it. And even then, after 5, I might consider just, playing some musical games with them, engaging with them musically. There's all sorts of fun things to do with just drums and xylophones. And, there are things that can happen that engage them musically that come before, let's just say, something like taking up the violin. But, we just heard that Albert Einstein got his first violin at the age of 5 and shortly thereafter began his lessons. So who am I to argue there? I would just really want it to be an enjoyable experience for them. That's just going to be the key. The earlier you start them, the more essential that must be. After the change of teeth, we have to all understand it's not all going to be follow your bliss. And if the child's not happy, don't do it. That is silly thinking. I'm sorry to say, but that's just not going to work out to create any real proficiency in any skill set. We all know through learning that you come to those periods where it's just simply work. You just have to do it. Today, I really don't feel like practicing the piano, but I need to. I know it. As adults, we know it. We just have to do it today. And tomorrow, I might be more inspired and it's more fun and I'm in a different emotional state. And now I'm remembering why I liked taking up piano in the first place. But there are times of just what you would call drudgery. And this happens for the young child as well. We do our best as parents and teachers to minimize those experiences and to keep it fun and light, do our very best. But know that something like formal music lessons for a 7-year-old, there are going to be times you just have to say, well, we're going to do it today. It may not be as fun today, but we're going to keep doing it. You just have to. There's no way around it. There are only measures we can take to minimize that aspect of the experience. I hope that helps. I just want to reiterate that every child is unique. That's a tough one to answer. For me, I don't go below 5 years old. And even then I would think carefully about how formally into musical instruction we're going at that age.
Great. Can you speak a little bit about Azure and veil painting and other specific arts found in Waldorf schools?
Yeah. Well, both of those, Lazure and veil painting, both of those are reserved for older students. Lazuring is the method you see in a lot of Waldorf schools or other anthroposophically inspired buildings where you're using washes of color on the walls. It's not a single coat of a solid color. It's a beautiful effect. It's supposed to have a wonderful sort of nurturing effect on the environment for the classroom for children. That's great. I mean, I think they're beautiful, so I've got no problem surrounding children with beauty. Whether it's a direct effect on the child's well-being, I don't know. I just think beauty in itself is, and lazuring technique is beautiful. So that's enough there. It's not something we teach students. We don't teach them to lazure. We do sometimes bring veil painting to the upper grades, 7th or 8th grade, and in high school. It's a similar sort of principle in that you're layering colors over time and creating sort of these almost 3-dimensional veiled type of effects that sometimes just hint at shape and depth and three-dimensionality on a two-dimensional surface. It's a very beautiful effect. It's a wonderful discipline for working with, instead of working with an artistic expression such as painting in one sitting, you're now working with that process over a much longer period of time, which has a different effect on the learning of the human being and relating to an artistic practice. So it's a wonderful practice. But again, that's reserved for the older children, certainly not something you bring to the younger children. What we most often bring, and even though it wasn't asked, I'll just speak to it briefly, what we most often bring in terms of painting in the grades, 1st through 7th, is a wet-on-wet watercolor painting method. Basically, we soak the watercolor paper and we use watercolor pigment to paint on that moist paper. And this requires not only a relationship to color that seems to have its own life, which just makes us more flexible, but we also learn how to balance that sense of flexibility with our desire to control and realize forms or new colors through blending and so forth in the painting process. And when you're putting wet pigment on a wet piece of paper, that's a challenge. It's easy to make a puddle of brown. But over time, with repeated exposure to this, the child learns not only how to manage form, not only how to manage colors, but also how to manage this element of the wetness and dryness, because over the course of a painting process, your paper is slowly but surely drying out, depending on the ambient humidity of the environment. So there are lots of factors at play in the wet-on-wet painting method, and I think it's just a great experience. We also like for them to experience other visual artistic techniques, drawing with crayons, drawing with pencils, drawing with charcoal, et cetera, et cetera. We like to experience all of those more controllable types of, even I'd say drier mediums and techniques. But that wet-on-wet method of watercolor painting, that one is a really important aspect, I believe, and has its very unique qualities that it brings in its challenges and benefits, which is why it's one of the courses that I've created for the first 4 grades at Simply Waldorf, and even before I created the core curriculum of language arts and math, I created the 3rd and 4th grade painting courses because they're just so unique and so important.
Great. How much art is too much compared to academics in a school day?
Oh, goodness gracious. That's such a big question. Well, it depends on the grade we're talking about, obviously. Gosh, I don't even know how to answer that. There's no magic formula. Basically, what I want to do, I'm just going to kind of I'm going to create a contrast between the early grades and the upper grades. So in the earlier grades, I'm definitely wanting to bring the academics, the basic foundational building blocks of language arts and math. That's in 1st and 2nd grade. That's how you alternate your lessons. You have these in a typical Waldorf school. There are lesson blocks, maybe 4 or 5 weeks of mathematics, and that's being supported through activity and artistic engagement. But listen to how I said it. It's being supported by. So I definitely want them to learn their numbers. I definitely want them to learn these gestures of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. These are activities that we personify with different characters in math, in the Waldorf education. We include drawings and activities they can do with marbles on their desks and counting seashells, and just engage them in as many ways as possible to support that learning. So I definitely want that academic lesson to be preserved. It's what we're learning. At the same time, I want the arts to be involved in that because they're mutually beneficial. And when engaging the whole human being through both, I've got the greatest chance of that lesson sticking. I say that now, realizing I should be careful to be specific about, I don't want to bring all the different artistic activities to one lesson. If, say, for example, today I'm teaching about addition, maybe I'm showing them the pattern of how 10 plus 1 is 11, 10 plus 2 is 12, 10 plus 3 is 13. It doesn't take long down that sequence for the child to figure out that pattern. It's a wonderful thing for them to experience. They love the order and the beauty of seeing patterns in a mathematical sense. But I can also do drawings that show 11 apples, 12 apples, 13 apples, or I could engage them in a clapping game where we're going to clap those numbers or we're going to stomp those numbers. But I wouldn't want to do all of it. I don't need to act it out, draw it out, paint it out, sculpt it with beeswax or clay, sing a song about it, write a poem about it, and what have I left out? Write a play about it. I don't need to do everything for every lesson. I just need to, over time, over the course of a week or so, I need to incorporate all those different activities. Sometimes I can bring even 2 to one lesson, but I don't want to overdo it. The whole idea is that each one of these modalities of artistic engagement enhance the learning and the development in their specific ways. So if we have a smattering of them throughout the week, we're really optimizing that learning. In the 8th grade, for example, there's much more of a focus on the academic portion of the lesson. I'm still bringing the arts to them. I'm still doing things artistically, but there's a much stronger academic abstraction involved. There's more logic. There's more data. There's more history. There's just more of what we kind of think of, I'm going to guess for all of us, in terms of just like the traditional education, reading, writing, arithmetic, that comes much more strongly to the fore in the upper grades. And it's a gradual progression along the way between the 1st grade and the 8th grade. And so the arts serve both as, for those main lessons, they serve as supportive mediums that enhance the learning. And throughout the rest of the day, they exist over the course of a week as their own disciplines. So I may have brought drawing to part of the lesson about math in the morning, but there may still be a form drawing course later in the day that lasts for 45 minutes, or there may still be a painting lesson, its own painting lesson that exists for a period later in the day. But gosh, that's a broad question to try and answer exhaustively, spanning all the grades.
Okay, next one. Any tips on how to undo any negative associations that may have built not great habits? For example, poor eating habits.
Yeah, that's a long road. First of all, let me just say it that way. Don't kid yourself. Once habits are established, it's a long road out of them. Because this is just, again, to affirm what we know about the human being, that once we do establish habits, they are persistent, and there's no way around it. So the only thing you can do is swim upstream. You've got the stream, and I don't say this with any fault. Did my kids ever develop some negative associations and some poor habits? Absolutely, lots of them. We're all human. So I, as a parent, made the stream head in the wrong direction, which meant in order to change that, me first, and my child too, had to swim upstream for a long time until the stream reversed. And we suddenly found out, oh, good, things are starting to support this new good habit. So the only way to do it is to present the positive association. Like I said, use the reward system to create new positive momentum, and it will take time. It's not a matter of 6 weeks now. If you're working against another habit, you got to go at least 6 weeks to undo that habit, probably another 6 weeks to like erase the after image of that habit, then work for another 6 weeks in some kind of nebulous vacuum, because who knows what the habit is now, and then another 6 weeks to maybe establish a new habit. There's 24 weeks right there, and I don't think I'm exaggerating. It's just such a fundamental truth of this age of development that once a habit is established, it is persistent. So we have to know as educators, as parents, that we are in for the long haul. And it makes it so important that we have a way of refreshing ourselves. You can get really burnt out as a parent or an educator when you know you're working against something like that, even when you know this is my own doing. I've created this habit in my child that I'm now trying to reverse. It's a long, hard journey. And so, do you have your own network of support? Do you have your own practice that refreshes yourself, whatever that may be? It could be meditation. It could be a chance to do Sudoku puzzles. I don't really care what it is. You'll find something that's healthy for you, where you get to have your own space as an individual, where you get to find your center and your groundedness. And then you can bring your best self into that effort, and it will be quite an effort. But again, just like the establishment of a positive habit in the first place, I recommend using the reward system. And let me also say, and don't do a lot of talking about it. This is not the age to try and reason with your child. The more talk you do, the more you sound like Charlie Brown's teacher. Those of you who may not be familiar with the Peanuts cartoon series, it was when I was a kid, it would show up sometimes, these Peanuts specials. And Charlie Brown's teacher, I think this was just genius by the creator, Charles Schulz. He never had us as the audience understand what the teacher said. The teacher always sounded like this. Brilliant, because that's what we sound like to children when we start explaining ourselves and justifying our decisions, when we start trying to rationalize our decisions as the adults. We have to remember, without being tyrannical, we're not tyrants, we're loving authorities. We know best, period, end of story. And if we've let them have a lot of play with us in terms of debating and pitching tantrums and doing all the things that children do to try and get their ways, if we've allowed that, well, there's another habit we're going to be working against for a while. But the best advice is to stop engaging in that way. You know best. You know best. Simple as that. And now I'm going to lovingly bring what I know is best into our reality every day, over and over, with nothing but love and firmness. It's not a mean firmness. It's not a totalitarian firmness. It's not a tyrannical firmness. It's the firmness of assurance that I am the parent and I know what's best, period. And the child simply doesn't. They simply do not know what is best. They have a sense for it that they're gaining from us and from their teachers and from their families and friends slowly, but they'll make all sorts of mistakes along the way that show they do not know what's best, not really, especially in those really important decisions. Good luck. That's a great question, and one that we all face, and one that's just simply difficult.
Great. I'm transitioning to Waldorf for my 5th and 6th graders next year. I noticed Simply Waldorf's curriculum does not reach those grades yet. Can you recommend a resource for curriculum for me for those grades?
No, there are some out there. I would try to find maybe some Waldorf homeschooling groups out there online, social media, wherever, and talk to parents who've actually used different programs. I'm not experienced with them. I feel it would be a little bit reckless for me to just throw out some names just because I've heard of them. I haven't actually used any of them. I've heard good reports of a number of different ones. So I do think that you have more than one viable option out there. But I think it would be a little irresponsible for me personally to make a personal recommendation without any direct experience. I think if you reach out, you'll find some resources of people who have direct experience, and they can tell you if you ask some key questions about, what you're looking for, where you need the most support in what you're trying to bring to a fifth or sixth grader. You'll find people with real experience that can help you.
Great, thank you. My son is 13 and I signed him up for a leisuring workshop. Do you think I should reconsider?
I'm sorry, what was the age again?
13.
Leisuring? Oh, no, it's not going to hurt him. No, by any means. It's kind of, like I said, it's kind of like veil painting. We bring that to the upper grades anyway. I would go with him personally. I wouldn't just leave him with some other adults, even adults who leisure. You want to make sure that your impressionable youth are around quality people. That, like I said in that one slide about the thinking force, is one of the vitally important experiences children need to have in this age, right around adolescence and beyond, is the experience of expertise. So finding someone who's an expert in a particular field, like leisuring, which is just, if this is a quality person, a kind person who's also an expert, what a great experience for a 13-year-old. Okay. At the same time, you need to be sure that that's a quality person that will not just use your child as sort of like a worker. Like, I'm going to show you a little bit now get to work over there. If the person is truly sincere about sharing their expertise, and so that the child, this youth, can experience not only the technical expertise that this person is bringing to bear, but also the quality of their being at the same time. Well, that's a wonderful experience for a youth, and I wouldn't hesitate. But if I didn't know all of those things were in place, I would definitely be accompanying my child in that situation to be sure.
Great. As a 16-year-old who learned of Waldorf philosophy and anthroposophy only 2 years ago, I am wondering what resources you would recommend for someone who is growing into adulthood and would like to become a Waldorf teacher. I am the only one in my family who is interested in Waldorf.
Wow. Okay. Well, I congratulate you on your individuation process. I'm taking it that you're 18 years old if 2 years ago you were 16 and you first found Waldorf education. That's remarkable. It's remarkable. Because I don't think at 16 or 18 I would have recognized the value of it. So I'm impressed by that, first of all. Secondly, I would recommend that you contact gosh, there are lots of avenues you could go through. You could certainly contact, I don't know where you live, but you could look around for some local Waldorf schools and share this exact same question with them and see if there are local branches of what's called the Anthroposophical Society. That's a big word. Anthroposophy, you've probably already come across that if you've investigated. Anthroposophy is the broader philosophical system that Rudolf Steiner developed, out of which Waldorf education is one application. There's also anthroposophical medicine. There's also biodynamic agriculture. All of these have their basis in anthroposophy. And there are anthroposophical, there is a worldwide anthroposophical society, and there are different branches and groups that meet locally for members of that society. There are different levels of classes you can take as members of that society and so forth. That's up to you. Those are individual choices. I don't recommend for or against that. But my first step for exploring those options would be to contact someone who knows if that's even available in your area. If not, you can still join the Anthroposophical Society and receive publications that come out monthly that are very interesting and wide-ranging in their in the topics that they cover. I received that publication and find it incredibly inspiring, not just in the realm of education, but across all those disciplines I mentioned. And then in terms of becoming a Waldorf teacher, yeah, well, that's a huge step. And not that I think, choosing any, let me say it that way. choosing any career at the age of 18 is a huge step. If you are truly inspired in that way, then I would suggest finding out what options you have for either being an employee or an intern at an actual Waldorf school. And then that depends on what level of education you're interested in, whether it's early childhood or the grades or high school. And you could try, gaining some experience and exposure in all three of those levels, depending on where you are. And that will start to speak to you. And this is where I don't think I have to say too much, because I'm a firm believer in Providence providing us guides when we ask the universe to help us. It was a hitchhiker who first mentioned Rudolf Steiner to me, and that changed my whole life. So I firmly believe that if you do what you did right here and you just reach out, I've given you a couple of pointers in some directions. Follow those, and you're going to find other people who are closer to your path than someone on a Zoom call, someone you can actually talk to in person, someone you'll have those deeper senses. You'll have those real intuitions, those real inspirations that will guide you. Trust them, trust your heart, and good luck. I'm so excited for you.
Well, I think we have come to the end of the questions. I'm pretty sure I kind of went back to skim. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Brian, for facilitating that. Thank you all for your questions and your attention. I'm surprised so many people have stayed this long. I know we've gone 38 minutes past our time, but I really appreciate it. And I hope this was helpful. As Brian said before, please, if you think of another question later, feel free to write to us. We're happy to receive interactions from folks, and I'm always happy to try and answer questions. I do my best. I don't pretend that I can answer every question, but I do my best. And even if I come across a question I can't answer, I'll either research it and try to learn more, or I'll try to contact someone who's more capable of answering a question than I am. So yeah, thanks again. I've really enjoyed this time with you, and I hope you have too. If you're interested, please check us out. Let me give one plug to our program, Simply Waldorf. If you're not familiar with Simply Waldorf, please check us out at simplywaldorf.com. We offer classes both in the early grades, academic classes, but also in the arts, as we've talked about here, through the first 4 grades. And we're constantly developing more and more courses and resources for people to use in whatever educational setting you find yourself. So we appreciate that as well. That's it. Have a great day, and we'll see you sometime, hopefully in the future.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.